my time as a journalist, I spent covering the education beat, as we say in journalism. So I was writing about the education of young people mainly. So I interviewed a lot of children, and many of their stories, stuck with me. And you see that in Djinn Patrol, it was very much influenced by those children and teenagers that I had interviewed. Sometimes you come across stories that kind of stay in the back of your mind. In one particular instance, I remember interviewing a boy who had lost everything in a fire in a settlement, pretty much like the one in Djinn Patrol. And I remember him telling me that he really wanted to study, and now he didn't have any of his books. And that kind of stayed with me. And after the story came out in the newspaper, I did have people calling me up wanting to contribute funds to the boy. So that was a good part. And then I also remember writing this particular story of this person again growing up in an impoverished settlement, and they didn't have a lot of they didn't have much money, and the kind of sacrifices this boy's family made so that he could write the civil service exams, which are quite prestigious in India and essentially guarantees you a job for life. And I remember interviewing the boy and his family and writing about, the sacrifices that they had made so that he could study. And then when I was writing Pari in Djinn Patrol and on the Purple Line, I was remembering, the boy's experiences. And that it is possible, that you're not always, your life need not always be circumscribed by the social realities. Unfortunately, the odds are really stacked against you because there's so much societal neglect and lack of political will. But once in a while, you come across stories when someone was able to still fight those odds. And I guess because it's so rare, those are the kind of stories that stay in your mind. With Djinn Patrol on the Purple Line, it really started as initially as a nonfiction project because I wanted to write about the children who went missing in these impoverished settlements all across India, but particularly in North India, where I had been living before I moved to the UK. And so there were these settlements where a number of children were going missing. And we didn't see their stories at all. We didn't hear about their friends. We didn't know what their experience was like living, in an area where you could be kidnapped or snatched at any point of time. So I wanted to write a report about these children by speaking to them, but for various reasons that never worked out. And after I moved to the UK, I was still thinking about these disappearances and, about the children. And that's when I first had the idea to examine this subject through fiction. And I really wanted to center the voices of children because, that's what was missing in the mainstream discourse. Whenever you see a story about kidnappings of children coming to light, it's typically, the focus is completely on the perpetrator, and usually some lurid details about the crime. So the focus is never on the children. So I wanted to write a book where the focus would be only on the children. I wasn't really thinking it would be a crime novel or a mystery when I started out, but I remember speaking to a friend about the idea, and he said, why don't you use some of those tropes that you typically see in crime fiction, and what kind of novel would it be if you were to subvert some of those tropes? And then I thought about, writing the story as a take on, something that replicated the Sherlock Watson relationship, but from, what if that relationship was, among children. So you have Jai, who thinks he's Sherlock. He's a 9-year-old boy who lives in this impoverished settlement. And then you have his friend Pari, who is the same age as him and who's his classmate. And what we see as the book unfolds is that, he's living in this settlement where children are disappearing. And the way for him to exert control over that narrative is to imagine that he's a detective and he can solve this case. So that's why he's giving himself agency when in reality he actually has none. And so he sets off and tries to solve the case. And very quickly he realizes that Pari is much smarter than him. So he is relegated to the role of Watson. So that's one of the central relationships, but they also have a friend named Faiz, And Faiz is someone who works in shops, and he does whatever odd jobs to make money because those are his family circumstances. Of course, child labor is banned in India, but you typically find, you will find that there are children who are still working, and Faiz represents one of them. So you have this trio, and they're trying to solve the crime, and they are hoping to catch the kidnapper, but obviously they're just children, and there's only so much power that they have in these, in this situation, in this particularly challenging situation. So I started with Jay's voice, and I knew he had a friend, a girl who would be much smarter than him, because that was my experience. Not to feed into cliches or stereotypes, but when I was interviewing children, what I found was that boys had all this swagger because they used to get in their way. It's a very patriarchal and conservative society in most parts of India, and girls have to be much more they're very aware of the dangers in everyday life because they're exposed to it right from the time they're children. So they tend to have a pretty good head screwed onto their shoulders from the time they're children. So I knew that Pari would have a better handle on the world around her, and so she would be able to make sense of things in a way that Jay can't, because he has the privilege of gender. So that was the starting point, and the story really took off from there. Absolutely, the story is based on real life instances of children going missing. Unfortunately, there are many such stories in India. But at the same time, I did not want to mirror a real life story because I felt that that would be trespassing on the grief of families who are going through a really difficult time. There are many families who still don't know where their children are, and many of them are still waiting for kids who went missing a decade or 2 decades ago. So there are no answers, and I felt that I could not you know take a real life story and then fictionalize it in that sense. So I was very much influenced by what happened in real life, and especially in the reactions of the police and the politicians and the community at large. What you see are the typical reactions, in Indian communities, where there's a tendency today to blame everything on religion or to blame minorities for whatever is wrong in the country. Um, and the police definitely are almost never on the side of those who don't have power or money. And the judicial system hasn't been very successful in, arresting perpetrators or even keeping them in prison. Almost all of them, if someone is caught, they're released very, very, very easily and very early. So without even serving a proper sentence. So which means that there's hardly anything to deter people from trying these things again and again. So in that sense, everything is pretty much very realistic. So it is drawn from reality, from what I'd seen as a journalist, from speaking to charities who work in this field. But beyond that, I wanted to really use my imagination because I felt that it was too dangerous to talk about real people and real stories, and I felt I didn't have the right to do that. But I can say that very broadly, the reasons why children are kidnapped in India, it's essentially related to child trafficking. A number of children are taken away from India to the next country, which is Nepal, where they're forced to work in brick kilns, or they're forced to work in factories where, children make clothes. So there are some industries in which it's thought to be beneficial to use children because they have nimble hands and light hands, and for some particular kinds of craft and kind of embroidery work, they believe that it's better to use children. And unfortunately, there are rates consistently. So every once in a while, you'll come across a headline which talks about, a big brand, and how these were sewn in, they were made in sweatshops in India or, another country in the global south. And so this is why mostly children are kidnapped, but sometimes they're kidnapped for, because there are people who want to abuse them. Sometimes they're kidnapped for they're taken away to cities where they're employed as domestic laborers. And people don't have to pay these children a lot of money. They're kept locked up in a room and they're just let out to do the work around the house. Because of poverty, many parents may actually feel that this is a better life for their children than it is, than they would have, at home with them, where they may not even have enough food to eat. So it's a very complicated, very complex reality. And the reason why it persists is because, ultimately it's because as a people, I'm counting myself as an Indian, even if I don't live there now full time. It's because we are able to turn away from these injustices. We have, I think, because we see it so often, many of us have become desensitized to what we see, the kind of poverty that may exist. And then there's a whole narrative that India is, it's going to become a superpower, and it's a kind of narrative promoted through government propaganda. And these kind of stories about poverty and the ways in which we have failed, such large swaths of a population, that doesn't feed into this narrative of how India is a developing, going to be a superpower soon. So they're easily ignored. So in some ways, I wanted to say in the story that all of us are complicit. The reason why this is happening and continues to happen is because, every single Indian, and I count myself as one of them, we have in some ways aided, contributed to this problem as well. And I hope there are lines in the book, in the novel, that point the finger to everyone, including, people who go into these places and want to write stories. And in that way, I was indicting myself within the novel, and I felt it was important to do that.